Jefferson was consistent in his life in his opposition to slavery. His father died when he was 14 years old, leaving him to inherit and operate 5,000 acres of land. At age 14, he ran a 5,000-acre plantation and did pretty good at it. It included 20 slaves on it. When his father-in-law, John Wales, died, he and his wife inherited another 11,000 acres. That's a pretty good inheritance. And 135 slaves. Now, they always make it, well, he ended up owning 600 slaves in his life, buying and selling slaves, so he was just as guilty as anyone else in that. Well, yes, to some extent. Do you know why he purchased and sold slaves? It's because what usually happened at slave auctions? Two families. They got split up. Do you know why Jefferson bought and sold the slaves he did? To reunite those families. His slaves always got Sundays off to observe the Lord's Day. They had Christmas and holidays off, especially extra time in the winter months to do whatever they like. He paid them for vegetables raised, meat from hunting and fishing, anything they did extra outside of the normal working hours. Virginia laws changed often, making it very difficult to try to free slaves, which is why, as you can see, he very regularly tried to change the laws of Virginia to end slavery. And upon his death, it was the law, he could leave it in his will for his slaves to be freed if you don't have any debt. Well, Jefferson had a lot of debt. Number one, he was buying and selling slaves to reunite families. Two, though, he lived a rather lavish lifestyle, went all out, especially for guests if they would come, and so he was always in debt. He was always building stuff, too. He loved to build, he loved to design buildings and do construction and that kind of stuff, having stuff built there, having stuff built other places, so he was in significant debt. Therefore, upon his death, it was not allowed for his slaves to be freed. In fact, the slave auction, I believe it was in August of 1826, most of the slaves wrote in their letters and journals that that day of the auction was the saddest day of their lives because they knew they would be split up and they never knew if they'd see some of their family members ever again. That's Thomas Jefferson. And Mr. Jefferson, when it came time to write the Declaration of Independence, there are 27 charges against the king. In the middle of the Declaration of Independence, there are all the charges against the king of why we are breaking away, because he's done this, he's done this, he's done this, he's done this. He's violated all these laws, and therefore we are going to break away. And in that list, the final one, the biggest, worst one, the one he writes more about than any other, is this one. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people, because where are they coming from? Africa, who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. Remember, a quarter of them would die, at least a quarter would die. Sometimes it was 40, 50, 60% on those ships would die because of the horrible conditions. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers. What position does the King of England have in the Church of England? He's the head of it. What kind of powers does Jefferson say he's using when he gives his blessing to the slave trade? Infidel powers. Is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain? You hear him calling him out? By the way, all the capitalizing and underlining is his. Determined to keep open a market where, what's that word there? Right there. Men should be bought and sold. In his entire draft of the Declaration, all 4 pages of it, this is page 3, there's only one word and one word only in the entire draft that he puts in all caps. And it's when he declares that all these slaves are not property, they are people. These are men. And it's the greatest injustice and why we must break away from the king. Now, how many of you have read that in the Declaration of Independence? Yeah, it shouldn't be any of you. Because everything in the Declaration had to be voted on unanimously by all 13 in order to remain in the Declaration or to be added to the Declaration. And South Carolina and Georgia said, well, that sounds really good, but we're pretty sure that won't pass back home, so we can't approve that paragraph. But 11 of the 13 did approve of it, including North Carolina and Virginia and Maryland. Major slave states said, yes, we want that in there. That blows my mind. Therefore, it was struck from the Declaration of Independence. That's Thomas Jefferson and slavery. He did everything he could in his time to try to remedy it and hoped for a better tomorrow. And the whole thing about Sally Hemings, if you want to know more about that, come see me afterward, okay? George Washington, I mentioned last night we would talk about him and slavery. George inherited 10 slaves at the age of 11 when his father died and he took over Ferry Farm. He would go on later to buy and sell more. He gained 84 when he married Martha. And he was raised in a slave culture and believed there was nothing wrong with it because that was how he was raised. Even still, though, they only worked 6-day weeks. They always got Sundays off as well. They had their own homes and gardens and chickens and other things to take care of for themselves. That was purely their own to have. They weren't his. It was theirs. They were free to visit people at other plantations, other family members or friends, and he would give special passes to make sure they'd be able to travel without being harassed or anything like that. He believed that punishment should be rare, should be enforced, but should be rare. He preferred incentives like cash. I mean, who doesn't? And in order for a slave to be punished or flogged, there had to be written permission from Washington himself. It was not left to his taskmasters. He had to personally hear the story from both sides before he would allow that to happen. He frequently cared for the ill or injured personally, would come to their home to see how they were doing. He provided doctors and midwives, and when it became available, he had all of his slaves inoculated from smallpox. What happened to George was he ended up fighting a war for freedom, and that got him thinking about things. And he met people who were kind of passionate about this, and he listened to them and thought they made a lot of sense. And there was something in him that was telling him this isn't a good thing. And during that time, and from there on, he began to privately and somewhat publicly express his view of how much he would love to see this institution done away with, to see slavery come to an end. And you can find letters that he wrote and the things he says about that, and was praying and hoping there would be a solution come someday that it would end. If you ever get the chance to learn about Billy Lee here in that painting with him, Billy Lee was one of his slaves who was one of his best friends, was with him throughout all the war, would be the one who would stay with him. And so after all of the arguing and the debating and the headaches from his war councils trying to figure out what to do, he'd go back to his tent, and there was Billy Lee. Billy, can I chat with you a little bit, let off a little steam? Sure you can, go right ahead. And he was a very dear friend to him. In fact, so when Washington dies there, we talked about his death last night, he had it in his will that once Martha died, all of his slaves were to be freed. And they had to be freed according to law that they could never be re-enslaved ever again. And if they were too young or not able or infirmed or too old to go out on their own, his estate would take care of them until they were either able to go out on their own or until they lived to their last and dying day, being taken care of by his estate. Billy Lee was one of those. He was old at the time, and he wasn't able to go out, and he stayed and lived his entire life there at Mount Vernon. Even though he was a free man, he was taken care of by the estate. In fact, George dies there in 1799. Martha doesn't wait. The very next year, she goes and she files the paperwork for his slaves to be freed because she knew how badly he wanted them to be freed, not to wait until she died. There were still slaves being taken care of by his estate, according to his will, into the 1830s. But, you know, we should probably tear down his statue and Jefferson's statue and all these guys, right? Yeah. It was a wonderful example of how someone could come to learn the truth and want to do. Something that struck me, I got to visit Mount Vernon again this past June, and I had never realized until this trip. We went down to his grave in his tomb where he's buried, and he's right there and everything. So is all the other family members there. Right beside that is the slave cemetery. It's right there beside his. That blew me away because usually at plantations you find in the South, are the slaves buried right there with their master? Oh, no, they're clear on the other side of the plantation. No, not so at Mount Vernon. They're right there. They're all together. I was just blown away by that. Couldn't believe it. Rather, this is just a glimpse of the truth that America was not founded as a tyrannical state dedicated to the preservation and expansion of slavery. Rather, do you know who Abraham Lincoln credited for paving the pathway to ending slavery? The founding fathers. The founders, the authors of the Declaration and the Constitution, and the first lawmakers of the United States. Let me give you a little excerpt from a speech he gave in Peoria, Illinois on October 16, 1854. Okay, here we go. The argument of necessity was, he had this high-pitched voice from Kentucky. Okay, that's what everybody says. It squeaked at times or anything. Was the only argument they ever admitted in favor of slavery. And so far only as it carried them did they ever go. They found the institution existing among us, which they could not help, and they cast blame upon the British king for having permitted its introduction. Remember, we just saw that from Jefferson. Before the Constitution, they prohibited its introduction into the Northwestern Territory, the only country we own, then freed from it. At the framing and adoption of the Constitution, they forbore to so much as mention the word slave or slavery in the whole instrument. In the provision for the recovery of fugitives, the slave is spoken of as a person held to service or labor. In that prohibiting the abolition of the African slave trade for 20 years, that trade is spoken of as the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit, etc. These are the only provisions alluding to slavery. Thus the thing is hid away in the Constitution, just as an afflicted man hides away a wean or cancer, when he dares not cut out at once, lest he bleed to death, with the promise, nevertheless, that the cutting may begin at the end of a given time. Less than this our fathers could not do, and now more they would not do. Necessity drove them so far, and farther they would not go. But this is not all. The earliest Congress under the Constitution took the same view of slavery. They hedged and hemmed it into the narrowest limits of necessity. In 1794, they prohibited an outgoing slave trade, that is the taking of slaves from the United States to sell. In 1798, they prohibited the bringing of slaves from Africa into the Mississippi Territory. This territory, then comprising what are now the states of Mississippi and Alabama. This was 10 years before they had the authority to do the same thing as to the states existing at the adoption of the Constitution. In 1800, they prohibited American citizens from trading in slaves between foreign countries, as for instance from Africa to Brazil. In 1803, they passed a law in aid of one or two state laws in restraint of the internal slave trade. In 1807, in apparent hot haste, they passed the law nearly a year in advance to take effect the first day of 1808, the very first day the Constitution would permit, prohibiting the African slave trade by heavy pecuniary and corporal penalties. Usually England gets the credit for the first to ever abolish the slave trade. We actually passed our law before they did. It's just that theirs took effect before ours could. Okay, not that I'm trying to be prejudiced toward us, but anyway. In 1820, finding these provisions ineffectual, they declared the trade piracy and annexed to it the extreme penalty of death. While all this was passing in the general government, 5 or 6 of the original slave states had adopted systems of gradual emancipation, and by which the institution was rapidly becoming extinct within these limits. Thus, we see the plain, unmistakable spirit of that age toward slavery was hostility to the principle and toleration only by necessity. And Lincoln never wavered from that position. He says almost the same thing, again, expounding further in February of 1860 in New York. In that speech, he noted that he had discovered that 39 framers of the Constitution, 22 had at some point voted to ban slavery in the new territories, 20 of which had voted against slavery, and the precedent of slowing down and stopping slavery was going to continue with him as president. And it eventually, through a costly, bloody war between the states, would end slavery once and for all. That was a battle within the war between good and evil. Now, don't take what I just said to think that I meant that everybody in the North was on the side of the good and everybody in the South was on the side of the bad. Is that what I said? No, that's not what I said. Okay? But this was a battle over liberty versus slavery, and was part of the battle between the war between good and evil. Okay? On the side of good, just for clarity, these two guys, Robert E. Lee and Thomas Stonewall Jackson. The Confederacy as a whole, not on the side of good regarding slavery. But these two men were. Robert E. Lee wrote on December 27, 1856, that slavery was a moral and political evil. He was hoping that the wise and merciful providence of God would soon end it. He joined his wife's and mother-in-law's efforts to free slaves. He set up schools for slaves in their Arlington home, that included Bible study. And as soon as the time of ownership of slaves left to him by the will of his father-in-law was up, according to Virginia law, he immediately freed them. So, are you ready? Are you ready? During the Civil War, Robert E. Lee did not own slaves while fighting for the South, because he had freed them, while on the side of the Union, General Grant technically had slaves in his home as an inheritance of his father-in-law, not freeing them until after the war. Is that not crazy? And Stonewall Jackson. Wow. Talk about a man of faith, devout, the hours he would spend in prayer and reading the scriptures. He owned 6 slaves in his life. 3 of them were a wedding gift, so by law, he was not allowed to free them, a mother and her 2 sons, I believe it was, which I'm thinking, who goes to the store and looks at the wedding registry? He's like, oh yeah, 3 slaves, that'd be good, right there. So by law, he was not allowed to free them. 2 he purchased because he had met them over the years, and they begged and pleaded with him, please rescue us from the condition we're in. We would love to come live in your home, because they knew what his home was like. And the 6th one was a little 4-year-old orphan girl that had a learning disability. And the old lady who had taken care of her couldn't anymore, and nobody else wanted her. And so Thomas took her to be with their family, and he and his wife Mary raised her as their own daughter. He organized Sunday school classes for slaves, taught them personally, because he never knew if anybody else would teach them, but he wanted them to know the scriptures. The preachers in the area said he was the greatest friend that any man from Africa could ever have. And he too despised slavery, doing everything he could to remedy the conditions and the times in which he lived. But, of course, we need to tear his statue down as well. For an example of the evil in the South, none other than the vice president of the Confederacy will do, Mr. Alexander Stephens. Now, there's argument sometimes that, well, the war wasn't over slavery, it was over states' rights. That's true. Over the state right to do what, though? Go back and read the secession documents of the states. Some of them give very detailed lists of all the infringements upon the South that they feel the North has committed, all these violations of government policy and everything like that. Some of them just say, we're just seceding, thank you. Okay, that was it, it's like one paragraph. Many of them, though, within that detailed list is all the details of how they've tried to stop them from having slavery, and the entire purpose of this is to maintain slavery. That wasn't in every one of those states' secession documents, but it was in many of them. And Alexander Stephens comes home on March 21st, 1861, to his home in Georgia. He goes to Savannah. He's just gotten back from Montgomery, Alabama, where the Provisional Congress of the Confederacy has met to draft their new Constitution. And he gives a speech to let everybody know what is in this new Constitution. And here are some excerpts of that speech. And again, I do the accents just for fun, so it doesn't get boring, all right? It's not to demean anybody or anything like that. So, all the essentials of the old Constitution, which have endeared it to the hearts of the American people, have been preserved and perpetuated. Some changes have been made. The new Constitution has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institution of African slavery, as it exists amongst us, the proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization. This was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. Notice what he says is the reason for this fight. And now look at what he says. Jefferson, in his forecast, had anticipated this as the rock upon which the old Union would split. He was right. The prevailing ideas entertained by him and most of the leading statesmen at the time of the formation of the old Constitution were that the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature, that it was wrong in principle, socially, morally, and politically. It was an evil they knew not well how to deal with, but the general opinion of the men of that day was that somehow or other, in the order of providence, the institution be evanescent and pass away. He totally agrees with Lincoln. That both sides agreed that the founders of this country intended and were working towards the eventual abolition of slavery. How is it people today don't understand that? Both the North and the South, that's like the one thing they could agree upon. This country was founded with the intention to forever end slavery. Yet those in academia today and the media say, oh no, this country was founded with the intention to perpetuate slavery. Is that not amazing? He continues. Those ideas, however, were fundamentally wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of the races. This was an error. It was a sandy foundation, and the government built upon it fell when the storm came and the wind blew. Did he just quote scripture? Ooh. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests. This became known as the cornerstone speech. Upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery's subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, moral truth. He's not done. As I stated, the truth of this principle may be slow in development, as all truths are, never have been, in the various branches of science. Oh, to what does he appeal? Oh, we'll come back to that science in just a second. Many governments have been founded upon the principle of the subordination and serfdom of certain classes of the same race. Such were and are in violation of the laws of nature. Our system commits no such violation of nature's law. With us, all of the white race, however high or low, rich or poor, are equal in the eye of the law. Not so with the Negro. Subordination is his place. Here's the science he so desperately cherished. Just 6 years after the Civil War, this was published. It was the belief of the time. It reads like this: at some future period, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. Excuse me, what's going to happen? Wow. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes, as Professor Sha'afa Hassan has remarked, will no doubt be exterminated. The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, for it will intervene between man and a more civilized state, as we may hope, even then more than the Caucasian, and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of as now between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. This was the science being taught in this book of 1871, The Descent of Man, authored by none other than Charles Darwin, in which he is arguing that someday the break between humans and apes or baboons or gorillas will be much more distinguished than it currently is, because as of now, Darwin was saying in his time, you can hardly tell any difference between somebody from Africa and a gorilla, because they've not evolved enough yet. His famous book on the origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored races, the struggle for life, was published in 1859, 2 years before the Civil War. You need to understand that this is the foundational motivation behind the current teaching of humanity evolving out of Africa. Who remembers, of course, we saw how this went last time, who remembers from your social studies class it being taught we came from the Fertile Crescent? Anybody remember that? Okay, we came from the Fertile Crescent, Middle East, okay? That was a biblical foundation because of our origins, and then the flood, and then Tower of Babel coming there. Okay, well, we can't have that anymore. And because of Darwin, and we understanding from him and all the ilk of scientists that came after him that taught, and I have a whole maybe 2-hour presentation on that, on the men who perpetuated this idea that the darker your skin, the less evolved you are. That is one of the foundational truths of evolution, of human evolution. And to this day, I guarantee, find it if you can, finding any natural history museum that discusses human evolution, and find for me any display where the skin color does not get darker the less evolved they're showing you. The opposite, where the more evolved you are, the more human you become, the lighter your skin gets. Find it anywhere in any natural history museum today. You won't. Every single one I've been to, I visited, it's the same thing every time. Hence, they now teach that we evolved out of Africa. This is the dogma of social Darwinism. Is the foundation for racism and for the horrible eugenics and Holocaust. and exterminations we've seen throughout the world. And yet, in the midst of that, who gets blamed in academia today for the evils of racism and slavery? Take a look.
The Atlantic slave trade also contributed to the development of racist ideology.
Racist ideology.
Most African slavery had no deeper reason than legal punishment or
from
intertribal warfare. But the Europeans who preached a universal religion and who had long ago outlawed enslaving fellow Christians needed justification for a practice so obviously at odds with their ideals of equality. So they claimed that Africans were biologically inferior and destined to be slaves,
Christians did,
making great efforts to justify this theory. Thus, slavery in Europe and the Americas acquired a racial basis, making it impossible for slaves and their future descendants to attain equal status in society. In all of these ways, the Atlantic slave trade was an injustice on a massive scale, whose impact has continued long after its abolition.
The current art of politics is to accuse your opponent of what you're actually doing. It's also the current art of education. Christianity and the Bible, are they to be blamed for the evils of slavery and racism? Well, we've already dispelled the ludicrous notion of the Bible being a champion of slavery, when in fact it is a champion of liberty and freedom. The ultimate freedom coming in who? In Christ. Luke chapter 4, verse 18, quoting Isaiah 61:1, Jesus said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed." How is that freedom made available? Jesus said in John chapter 8, "If you continue in my word, then you are truly disciples of mine, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." And so he said in verse 36, "If the Son sets you free, you are free indeed." And what's funny is, science has actually finally caught up with the Bible. Remember how we read earlier in Acts chapter 17, he made from one nation every nation of mankind? In my secular evolutionary biology college textbook came this chart right here. I've found others since then. This one is right out of my freshman level biology evolutionary textbook in college. And the professor said, when you examine what we've learned about skin color and how it's just different levels of melanin in the skin, the professor asked this question to the students: tell me, at which point do you become a different race of humanity? And then the professor reminded, by the way, the word race in science means subspecies. And at what point do you become a different race of humanity? How can we say you're a different race of man because of skin color? Do we do that with eye color? Do we do that with hair color? We don't even do that with blood type. That might make more sense. But we don't even do that. And the professor in the secular universe said there's not. Science has shown we are one race. What has this said for 2,000 years? Oh, you mean the Bible science was right again? How many races are there? One. We need to get that word out of our vocabulary if we're going to represent this book and represent our Creator God. There's no such thing as different races of people. Different ethnicity, nationality, background. I mean, the person you're sitting by doesn't have the exact same color, skin color you got. Can you imagine if God made us all with the exact same color? How bland would we all be? Look at the beauty of His creation. It's funny, I'm sitting there and I'm looking at it, I'm like, oh, that's funny. Oh, look at what the evolutionists had to admit in their science. Notice where everybody came from. Two individuals who had the perfect, complete genome to give rise to all who would ever be born. I wanted to raise my hand in class and go, I know their names. Adam and Eve right there on the textbook. It was amazing. we need to realize that every person is a precious, cherished image bearer of our Creator God. So, back to that train in Philadelphia, waiting for the package to arrive. You thought we'd forgotten about it. On the night of February 22nd, 1861, the package actually contained nothing. It was empty. It was just a fail-safe that the train could not leave until the two men, the lady and her invalid son, were on board the train. The package had been sent by one of those two men. His name was Alan Pinkerton, who was in the midst of forming his Pinkerton Agency. He was overseeing the whole operation. The other man was 300-pound barroom brawler Ward Layman, who was working for Pinkerton. The lady was Kate Warren, one of Pinkerton's agents. And the invalid son, who was kindly let in the back door of the train so that he wouldn't have to be seen and be embarrassed in front of all the passengers, was a gentleman named Abraham Lincoln. Just the night before, Pinkerton had informed him of the assassination plots to take place in Baltimore, where he would arrive and there'd be great crowds filling the streets, and he would have to travel all across town through those crowds to get to the other train station to catch the train to go to Washington for his inauguration. And spread out throughout all those crowds were many assigned with the task to kill him. Even then, the building fervor over Lincoln's election was increasingly exponential, and the majority of the South believing he was going to attempt to end slavery once for all. Lincoln, though, refused to leave Philadelphia until he had participated in the George Washington commemorative birthday celebrations, including personally raising the American flag over Independence Hall. This is an actual photograph of the event, okay? Let me circle here for you. There's Lincoln, and there's his son, Tad, as they were there for it. They were unveiling a new flag. It wouldn't actually become an official flag of the United States, but he was unveiling it because there was a new star that was added to it for the new state being added to the Union named Kansas. In that morning ceremony, Lincoln gives a short speech, just having learned of the assassination plot just hours earlier. This is part of that speech he gave in the very room where the Declaration and the Constitution were signed. And this is what he said. I am filled with deep emotion at finding myself standing here in this place where we're collected together, the wisdom, the patriotism, the devotion to principle from which sprang the institutions under which we live. I've often pondered over the dangers which were incurred by the men who assembled here and framed and adopted that Declaration of Independence. I've pondered over the toils that were endured by the officers and soldiers of the Army who achieved that independence. It was not the mere matter of the separation of the colonies from the motherland, but that sentiment in the Declaration of Independence which gave liberty not alone to the people of this country, but I hope to the world for all future time. All great applause erupts. Yes, whatever. It was that which gave promise that in due time the weight would be lifted from the shoulders of all men. This is a sentiment embodied in the Declaration of Independence. Rousing cheers, yes, of this campaign speech. Now, my friends, can this country be saved upon this basis? Well, if it can, I will consider myself one of the happiest men in the world if I can help to save it. But if this country cannot be saved without giving up that principle, and he paused, and then he said, I was about to say I would rather be assassinated on this spot than surrender it. He then goes on to talk about trying to avoid war and bloodshed and keep the country united. And then he concludes, "My friends, this is wholly an unexpected speech, and I did not expect to be called upon to say a word when I came in here. I suppose it was merely to do something toward raising the flag. I may therefore have said something indiscreet." And they said, No, you're doing great. Keep going, keep going. It's never happened to me, but he said, "But I've said nothing but what I'm willing to live by, and if it be the pleasure of Almighty God, to die by." And he did both. Lincoln will safely arrive in Washington, D.C., where he will be inaugurated the 16th President of the United States. Best part about that story? The Chief Justice who gives him the oath of office to swear him in is Roger Taney. Roger Taney is the one who wrote the decision for the Dred Scott case, in which he wrote that anybody with black skin cannot be a citizen of the United States. He's the one who has to swear in the president who will forever end slavery with the war and the 13th Amendment. Is that not evil? Is that not great? Serves him right. Lincoln lived by and died by his faith and beliefs in the war that preserved this country by ultimately ending the evils of slavery at a cost of 1.7 million casualties, including over 650-some-thousand deaths, more than all other wars combined. And you want to tell me that America is an evil country because of slavery after that sacrifice of blood and lives to forever end it? I don't think so. But this is the same attack upon Jesus and his church today in the war between good and evil. As it cost Jesus the sacrifice of his life, his blood, to forever be able to end enslavement to sin. If we accept his sacrifice and are clothed and covered with his life, as we talked about the other night. Paul preached in Acts 13, "Let it be known to you, brethren, through him forgiveness of sins is proclaimed to you, and through him everyone who believes is freed from all things which you could not be freed through the law of Moses." We covered that the other night. We covered Romans chapter 6, talking about he who has died is freed from sin. And thus John 8:36, the greatest emancipation proclamation. If Christ has set you free, you are free indeed. Paul wrote in Galatians chapter 5, verse 1, it was for freedom that Christ set us free. Therefore, keep standing firm, and do not be subject again to a yoke of slavery. See, we can only enslave ourselves, as 2 Peter 2 says, "For by what a man is overcome, by this he is enslaved." So, how are you going to fight in this war between good and evil? You are fighting for one side or the other, actively. And that's just not me saying that. If you're doing nothing, that is actively supporting evil. For James chapter 4, verse 17 says, "Therefore, to the one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is sin." We are to be active and engaged. We are to be fighting, but not in the way the world fights. How are we supposed to fight? The way Jesus would, with love, compassion, service to those who oppose us. Is that what they would do to us? No. That's why we do it. So they ask, "What is it with you? Why do you treat me this way?" Let me tell you why. It's somebody I really want you to know. We should be the first to stand up for our fellow citizens, to stand up for their rights. Christians should be the first to the election polls, whether you think your vote's going to count or not. Because many have given their lives, so you have that right, that freedom. And we are to be out there fighting the fight, the passion and power of Jesus Christ. So choose you this day whom you'll serve, which side you'll be on, whether Satan and his minions enslaved to sin, or with Christ and his eternal love in true freedom and liberty. Heavenly Father, that's our prayer tonight. We thank you for the freedom that comes in Jesus. Thank you, we can be clothed with forgiveness and holiness and eternal life. Thank you, somebody told us about Jesus. May we go and do likewise. May we be actively fighting in the war between good and evil, doing good, not for our glory, but for yours, so that your kingdom may come. And we see salvation, and we see revival, and we see change brought to lives. May that change start in us, is our prayer, our commitment, and our victory as we praise you and thank you and commit ourselves to you in Jesus' name. And those who will go fight for him said,